Hey everybody, it's Chris again. I had a few minutes and I wanted to address a question that has been presented to me quite often, actually, and that relates to tip hardness, tip shape, and tip selection, and what the pros and cons are of each. I'm not going to hit on every single aspect of it, but I will hit on the major points. The first one being a hard tip will last longer and it'll hold its shape over time, better. And the reason for that is because of the way a hard tip is constructed. A hard tip is constructed by compressing the fibers, making it more dense, and resulting in a harder tip. But the benefit of that is number one, less maintenance. Your sidewalls aren't going to mushroom. The radius isn't going to deform over time. It will require a little more tip maintenance, scuffing and stuff like that, but it's going to hold its shape longer. Now, the other thing is tip hardness, believe it or not, tip hardness does not directly impact this more or less spin on the cue ball. It doesn't matter how hard or how soft your tip is. And I know that I'm going to get a lot of blowback off of that very statement, but it's true. No matter how hard or soft your tip is, it does not change how much spin capability you have. Okay. Now, what will alter that is how far outside of your miscue point on the cue ball you are. And now that does play a part when it comes to a soft or hard tip, because you have your cue ball and you have the center of the cue ball. Well, the farther outside start hitting this ball, the more apt you are to miscue. And there's a certain point in that radius that is called a miscue point, and it's usually about 90%, okay, on average, before you begin to miscue. Now, that can be altered by your tip hardness. The harder your tip, the more towards the center of the cue ball you have to play before your miscue point. Your miscue point becomes a smaller radius. Same thing applies on the other side with a softer tip. The softer your tip is, the farther outside edge to the edge of that cue ball you can apply English. And that may be why people think that that tip hardness changes cue ball spin. Well, it doesn't. It only changes the ability to shoot farther outside of your center of the cue ball, which that does indirectly change your spin. Now, the other thing is tip hardness has no direct effect on cue ball deflection. However, if you, for example, have a soft tip and it is more dense and heavy, then that can change and add more deflection overall. But we're talking slightly, not a lot. And remember, the reason it does that is because the whole idea or intent of a low deflection shaft is to reduce overall front end mass, reduce the weight of the front third of the shaft. So naturally, the heavier the tip, the more deflection it's going to have overall. The heavier the ferrule, the more deflection it's going to have, which is the reason that we sometimes core the front end of the shaft, is to reduce that weight, to reduce that deflection. So again, not so much of an issue with your harder tips, but on your softer tips, if they are heavier and more dense, then that can add more deflection to your shaft. Another point is a soft tip will become harder over time. Not a lot of people recognize that point, but the more you use a tip, especially a soft, the more times that tip impacts that cue ball every time you hit it, it's compressing it more and more and more. Granted, it's very little at a time, microscopic amounts at a time, but over time is going to make that tip harder. So if you have what you think is a soft tip. The more you use it, eventually it's going to be a medium tip as far as tip density. And then the more you use that, it's going to become a hard tip. And a couple things are happening during that time. One, you are compressing the fibers, making that tip harder and harder, but also you're losing oil in the tip. Every time you hit that key ball, a little bit of oil is dispersed from that tip. And granted, I'm not talking about changing the oil in your car. It's not something that you see, but the oil is squirted out of the tip on a microscopic level. And eventually, and I'm sure you've experienced this at some point, your tip ends up chipping off just a little section of it in the top surface. It's because that particular section was dry. It had no oil in it. Every tip, every piece of leather has oil content, different degrees of oil depending on the leather type, but nonetheless, they all have oil. So the more you use it, the harder it will become and the drier it will become. I recommend changing your tip every 6 to 8 months, no matter what tip you have. And that helps to alleviate that happening. Can you use certain tips longer than that period? Yeah, sure you can. But is it worth the risk? I don't think so. If you're in a major tournament and part of your tip pops off or chips off, you'll wish you had changed it. So I would advise changing your tip every 6 to 8 months, just to be on the safe side, no matter the brand. And another point is a harder tip can provide more draw on the cue ball due to the spin speed. And why that happens is because when you make contact, this is with a hard tip, when you make contact with the cue ball with a hard tip, well, the cue ball will leave the surface of the tip much faster than it would if you had a softer tip and made contact. A softer tip is going to kind of hold on to the ball a little more because it compresses. So therefore, it's going to be around, it's going to be touching that cue ball longer. Granted, we're talking milliseconds, but those milliseconds matter when it comes to transference of energy. So a harder tip is going to leave the cue ball faster, therefore retaining the power that you put into it and transferring the power that you put into it, resulting in more speed at the tip. And the more speed at the tip you have, especially in draw shots, the more bottom spin that can be applied. Therefore, the more draw you'll have from it. A softer tip, you'll have a little bit more control, especially on finesse shots. But overall, a harder tip is going to transfer more energy, which, if you think about it, makes total sense. Just like in your jump cues and your break cues, you see phenolic and acrylic and different types of material for your tip. They're rock hard, and that's why, because of the transference of energy. Now, it also aids in jumping balls, a very hard tip, because of the fact that it leaves the tip of the cue ball sooner. It can then push that shaft out of the way and make the cue ball come off the surface faster, which can help with very short distance jump shots when the intermediate ball is closer to the cue ball. Because the way a jump shot happens is you're physically pushing that cue ball into the slate. Well, you have to get the shaft out of the way when that cue ball decides to come back up. If you don't, then obviously you're going to have a much lower percentage of a jumping ball accurately, and it's not going to have as much rise to it. So a harder tip is going to help do that. It's going to help push that shaft out of the way so the cue ball can do its thing. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about is the shape of your tip. The rounder shape you have, like a dime, for example, it will allow for a more uniform contact from farther from center, from your miscue point. Again, you have your cue ball and you have your center of the cue ball, and then you've got the outside maximum area where you can hit that before you miscue. Well, a softer tip is going to let you go farther to the outside edge than a harder tip will. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but a harder tip, you are being forced to shoot and play closer to center ball. And that's kind of restricting you a little bit. A softer tip, you can go farther outside and in turn get more English or more spin. But the tip itself does not change the spin. It only changes how far outside of center you can go. Now, a flatter tip, like a quarter radius tip, is going to be more forgiving. And what I mean by more forgiving is a flatter tip is going to give you more compensation for unintentional English. What I mean by that is if you're putting left English on the ball and you think in your mind you're putting one tip to the left, when in reality you're putting a tip and a quarter or a tip and a half to the left between your backstroke and your follow through, then that's called unintentional English because you didn't mean to do that. Well, a flatter tip creates a larger sweet spot and will help alleviate that issue from happening. Now, a nickel or dime radius is really, this is the last tip on that. A nickel or dime radius is really only going to be noticeable on your smaller shaft diameters. On your smaller shaft diameters, you have more of a curvature, okay? Or rather, more of the curvature is noticed. Example, if I had a 13 millimeter shaft and I put a nickel radius on it, well, even though the radius is still the same radius, angles, it's going to be flatter than, it's going to be rounder than if it was put on a 10 millimeter shaft per se. If you put that same nickel radius on a 10 millimeter shaft, it's going to be a lot flatter than it would on a 13 millimeter shaft. Therefore, change impact points, scratch retention, things like that. But it doesn't really apply so much on your larger shaft diameters, whether it's a nickel, quarter, dime radius, but it really is amplified on your sub 12 millimeter shafts, 11.5, 11.75, 11.25, things like that. So you really got to pay attention to that. What I would recommend on your smaller shaft diameters is a dime radius. And on your larger shaft diameters, not so much. I would stick it around a nickel or a quarter, because again, the flatter the tip, the more forgiving that shaft overall is going to be. Now, that's about all I want to discuss right now. We can talk about this for hours, but I wanted to hit on the main points. Here again, this is a short video. I was asked a question a while back and I had time to answer it, and I hope I have done so. If you have, and I'm sure you have, developed questions about this, please put them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to address them as best as I can. If you have ideas on new discussion topics, put that in the comments as well. We'll be more than happy to make a video on that topic, Ed or I one. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have not subscribed, please take the time to subscribe. We got a lot more stuff coming. But we also have a new membership function on the website. On YouTube. It's $4.99 a month, and it's a membership. You get certain perks with the membership that you don't get by just simply subscribing, and it's pennies a day, $4.99 a month. It helps support our channel, and you get a couple extra perks in between. And you can do that by clicking the join button right beside the subscribe button at the bottom of your page there. Either way, I appreciate your time. I hope you found it useful. I hope it was informative. and I hope it made sense. Until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, guys.